This is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Philip Bennett takes your questions about reporting on government secrets. Bennett is a former managing editor of the Washington Post. At Duke, he is the Eugene C. Patterson Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke's Sanford School. This semester, he's teaching two courses: Narrative Journalism and the Web, and Islam and the Media. To ask Bennett a question, send an email to live@duke.edu. Tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. Tell us what you think. Fill out the brief survey on the Duke Office Hours website. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm David Jarmel, the head of Duke University's Office of News and Communications, and Phil Bennett. Thanks for joining us here on Office Hours. Thank you, David. You led the Washington Post to 10 Pulitzer Prizes and other awards. If you were at the paper right now, what kinds of investigative stories might you be going after? Would it be what's happening in the Middle East today, healthcare, something else? And how does a paper like the Post go about making those decisions about what to investigate?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. You know, in the same way that editors don't win Pulitzer Prizes, investigative projects don't emerge sort of fully born and imagined out of the heads of editors. And I think when we talk to Mark Mazzetti in a couple of minutes, one of the things I would do if I were looking for investigative subjects today would be talking to someone like Mark and saying sort of, what are you hearing, what's out there? So there's raw material that tends to generate a series of questions. And if you feel like those questions can't be answered through more conventional means, that you need to sort of mass some sort of reporting power against them and take longer and go deeper in order to answer those questions, then that's a good subject for an investigative project. You know, I would cite two kinds of things that I think I think about still, and I worry about a lot about in the context of changing landscape of journalism. You know, one are investigative projects that involve local issues. So, not national or international scandal, but real accountability journalism at the local level. That's a lot of what we're thinking about at the DeWitt Wallace Center in the Sanford School, about how to create tools for local journalists to mine data and to do investigative work. And the other thing that I think there's room for are narrative projects, narrative investigations. If you think about still the week since the Tucson shootings, there hasn't emerged from that yet a real comprehensive, deep narrative account of what actually happened. We have more fragmented versions of those events than we did, I think, at a height of narrative writing in journalism. And I think that deficit is something that can keep us from getting a deeper understanding of events.
So at a paper like the Post, are those decisions about which stories to go after, are those made by the editors, by a reporter?
Well, you know, I think the way that it happens every kind of way, but the way that I think it is generally most productive is when a series of questions or facts that are otherwise difficult to link together arise from the reporting experience. And then in a conversation, and you know, everything that happens in a newsroom, or most everything that happens, has some communal element to it. Those things get batted around, and there's a process of peer review and criticism. And if you know, one of the first types of tests we apply to that is, you know, is it important and is it interesting? Is it something that holds our interest? Is it something that we think you know, we could sustain interest in and has relevance and importance to readers? So, and it helps to have a sort of outside perspective that editing can provide to try to answer those questions. But it almost always grows out of the facts, and I think, and out of questions. So even today, looking at, you mentioned the Middle East. So, you know, why is this happening? And if we could answer that in a day's reporting or 2 days reporting, well, that would be fine. But I suspect that it's going to take a deeper, more sustained, more iterative effort to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, so actually we have someone who's going to join us who's also covering what's happening in Egypt and the Middle East, and also can provide us a great example of doing an investigative story. So we have by Skype joining us Mark Mazzetti of the New York Times, who's in their Washington bureau. Mark, thanks for joining us. Mark has won the Pulitzer Prize, other journalism awards, and we're proud to say is a Duke alumnus. He's also the most recent recipient of the university's Futrell Award for Outstanding Achievement in Communications and Journalism. Mark, earlier this week you broke a big story, even by your standards, about a former CIA agent who appears to be running his own network of spies out of his home near San Diego. So maybe by way of example of investigative journalism for our viewers who missed the story briefly, can you tell us what you found?
Sure. I did this story. Took a fair amount of time to investigate, but the person's name is Dwayne Claridge, who's a longtime CIA veteran, but someone who retired in around 1990 from the CIA. Actually, he was forced retirement because of his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. He was indicted in the Iran-Contra scandal and then ultimately pardoned by the first President Bush. But he's someone who doesn't retire very, very easily, and for the last sort of 2 decades, he has, stayed in, he kept a hand in the secret world, and his latest endeavor is to run this spy network, gathering information in Afghanistan and Pakistan, originally under a Pentagon contract. So the Pentagon was actually paying him to do this, and part of it was because of the Pentagon's frustration with the CIA and the information that the CIA was giving them about militant groups in the region. So it's this interesting example of the privatization of security and the sort of ways that private citizens can exploit chaos in these war zones to sort of carry out their own agenda.
I want to ask you both about what's probably gotten the most publicity over the last several months regarding investigative journalism, which of course was WikiLeaks. And for good or for ill, it seems likely to change how governments and journalists and others are going to view investigative journalism. Phil, what do you think is going to be the impact on journalism of what we've seen with the whole WikiLeaks episode?
I don't think we really know. I think that it probably, as we get deeper into it, it's going to seem less some monumental watershed than just part of a progression in which technology certainly is playing a role in making the transfer of documents and information easier and frictionless and anonymous in some cases. And I read last week that the New York Times is considering setting up some sort of anonymous Dropbox for secrets, and I think that would be a new innovative thing. But I think that WikiLeaks is something that is a curious example because even though it seems it certainly heralded the rise of a new actor who we hadn't heard of and a new type of organization, it really depended on the New York Times, The Guardian, established journalism institutions to pore over these records and to really make sense of them and to figure out if they were credible and to vet them so that a process was undertaken in which there was an effort to keep dangerous, damaging information from entering the public domain. So I think in some ways it really reinforced the incredible value that an institution like the New York Times brings to that process.
So Mark Mazzetti of the New York Times, you are on the journalistic front lines of dealing with some of these issues. Do you have any concerns that the whole WikiLeaks episode is going to make governments less likely to share information with you in terms of public records or access and otherwise?
Well, at least in Washington, we find that we're already having a pretty hard time getting them to tell us anything. And so I actually don't know whether WikiLeaks is going to make it harder for us. I think that in one strange dynamic of this whole episode is that news organizations became, I think, in the eyes of some in the government, the more responsible actors in the whole drama, as opposed to WikiLeaks itself. And we got these documents going back to the original documents dealing with Afghanistan, which we published in July. We vetted them. We went to the government to sort of tell them what we were planning. And also, we redacted some documents, but mostly because they had names of people in them. And our concerns was that, someone's name showing up in a military intelligence report could get that person killed. And so that was our concern. So I agree with Phil that I think that it's unclear ultimately what all this will mean. Right now, WikiLeaks has done a number of different document dumps, but for the moment, their big claim to fame is documents they got from one military, low-level military analyst, and it was an amazing trove of information. But they're only good. Just like the New York Times or the Washington Post, they're only going to be as good as their sources. And if they don't continue to get the Bradley Mannings of the world to give them information, then no one will be talking about WikiLeaks next year or the year after. So it's going to depend on the sources coming forward and being willing to give up the information, just like it is with large news organizations.
You're watching Office Hours at Duke University, and we invite you to send in your questions for Phil Bennett and Mark Mazzetti. And in fact, we've gotten a question from Jay in Durham, and Phil, it's for you. And he writes, in Bob Woodward's recent book, the opening chapters contain information that would appear to be highly classified. What does the muted reaction to the release of this information, when compared to the reaction to WikiLeaks, tell us about how leaks are used in D.C.?
Yeah, well, that sort of goes to the heart of it. There's a joke in Washington that says, a secret is something you tell one person at a time. And, and there is obviously a marketplace for secrecy. First of all, there's a proliferation of secrets, so they exist at all levels. And that's why a private first class even could have access to a mass of secret documents. But in some sense, the struggle over WikiLeaks wasn't the struggle over the secrets themselves. It was struggle over who controls the secrets and how can they control them. And I think that the contrast that the question alludes to, which is that the secrets that were revealed in Obama's wars, which were the product of interviews conducted by Bob
Woodward's book
in the White House,
right,
and were of a magnitude much greater than I guess I would presume by having read them that they had a higher security or secrecy classification than many of the secrets, perhaps all of the secrets that were included in the WikiLeaks dump. That those were the product of, if not authorized leaking, then leaking that was accepted or condoned within the White House. We don't believe that there's been, or we don't know if there's been, I would be very surprised if there's been a leak investigation launched in the White House as a result of that book, or calls for source investigations to punish the people who told Woodward the things that he did. So I think that there's a cultural aspect and a political aspect that is wrapped around this entire issue. And I think it's true. Mark's colleague, Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times, has an interesting story in this Sunday's New York Times Magazine, in which he says that if not for the personality and character of Julian Assange, this whole episode might have been viewed differently. So I think there are a lot of elements in play there.
Mark Mazzetti, actually, we've received a follow-up question for you as well, and it's has the President's memorandum on transparency and open government had any impact on the agencies that you interact with on your national security beat?
I guess in a word, no. I cover the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've noticed no difference or new culture of transparency where they're very eager to tell reporters who cover them their secrets. We get a lot of press releases, but the press releases don't say very much. So, I think that across the board, not just with what I cover, a lot of people are questioning this supposed transparency agenda in the Obama administration. And it was, I think, the first act of the administration was this executive order saying that things should be, more secrets should be let out. The government should be more transparent. And it may be happening in other agencies that I don't cover.
I think we have lost the connection briefly with Mark Mazzetti. We'll try to get him back on.
I'm sure it had nothing to do with his answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll find out later. Phil, let me ask you a question. So we've been talking a lot about the process of how journalists go about digging out these stories and publishing them. How about the impact of the stories now that you have, let's for instance look at some of the stories. The Post won a remarkable 6 Pulitzer Prizes in 2008 for a variety of stories, several of which were investigative in nature. One was about the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. One was about violence with military contractors. Another was about the influence of Vice President Cheney. Looking back now, how much impact do you think those stories had?
You know, it's so hard to measure. And impact, plays out in different ways. I think informing the public is a form of impact that, although it may be the least easy or reliable to measure, is really at the core of the purpose of journalism. In a case like the Walter Reed reporting, in which 2 reporters uncovered a series of scandalous treatment of wounded veterans at the country's premier military medical center, I think that had very easily measured impact. In other words, people were fired, they lost their jobs, the situation was changed, there was a big political reaction to it. And if you were to contrast that, say, to the reporting on the role of Vice President Cheney, which I think was, an incredibly difficult target. Mark alluded to have the difficulty of getting people to talk to you. Well, this was a very black box to get inside of. And reporter Bart Gellman, now working for Time Magazine, was able to do that. Hard to measure the immediate response or impact, but I think that telling stories about revealing hidden features of the way our government operates can have an enduring impact on the way people understand the way the government works. And that may not result in a law or in any action that you can point to, but it can elevate the public discussion of an important issue.
We're getting a number of questions in from our viewers about the future of investigative journalism. As newspapers face serious economic problems and other parts of the mainstream media as well, many newspapers have been cutting back on reporters, and obviously there's a fear that investigative journalism is going to be cut as well. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's a danger. I think that there's been enormous pressure, obviously, on the business model of newspapers, and newspapers contribute the largest volume by far of reporting in general, but also of investigative reporting. And in an industry that's lost, 30,000 reporters over the last decade, that's obviously had an impact on those investigative units. Part of in the heyday of investigative reporting, what was most notable were the regional newspapers. Smaller newspapers had the resources to investigate their state governments or their local governments, and I think that's been the hardest hit in many areas, as those regional newspapers have folded their investigative units. Obviously, there are some really exciting potential models emerging of nonprofit organizations to fund investigations, like the website ProPublica, which conducts investigations and then gives the fruits of those investigations to print publications, oftentimes partnering with them. And you see partnerships of different kinds growing up. So I think that there is a certain robustness in that. And I think there are unexplored and still underdeveloped tools for investigation that involve data mining and other techniques that haven't been fully developed that could allow even a small group of journalists to leverage big amounts of data and discover hidden stories in it. So I think it is a concern. I think investigative journalism is that part of journalism where the interests of the publication and the role of journalism as a public trust align most closely. And so it's a very important part of journalism to pay attention to and to make sure that it doesn't disappear in a way that would keep a lot of important information from getting to the public.
Mark Mazzetti, I hear you're back with us again electronically, or are you there?
I'm here. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we're speculating maybe it was someone trying to keep secrets, trying to keep you off the air, but we're glad to have you
exactly.
back. Mark, as you can see, we're talking now about the future of investigative journalism, but I want to go back for a moment and ask you the question I asked Phil, which is we have talked about the process of how investigations are carried out and published, but what's the impact on the other end? Do you feel like your work actually changes things in Washington or elsewhere?
It's a good question. I think that sometimes the work we do will start investigations into government practices. First of all, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay.
We can see you as well.
There are sometimes investigations as the result of our work. I did a piece about tapes of interrogations CIA interrogations being destroyed that launched a criminal investigation of certain members of the CIA, and that I think Washington does change slowly. I think that the impact of investigations sometimes are sometimes maybe more limited than we would like. However, I think that the press, is, and this isn't self-congratulatory. I think the press has done a pretty good job since September 11th. Investigating what the government is doing, and I think that it's very hard to learn about some of the most classified programs out there. And this is not to say that we report them just because they're classified. Just because we know a secret doesn't mean that we report a secret. There has to be a reason for it. There has to be a news reason to do it. But I think that the media in Washington and elsewhere, and certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, for all of the problems the media is going through, I think that they have the media has been fairly effective in sort of keeping a watch over what the government is doing.
You're watching Office Hours at Duke University. Our guests today are Phil Bennett and Mark Mazzetti, who's joining us by Skype online. We invite your questions. And Phil, we've gotten a question that I'm going to send to you. It's from Leak, and he's talking about the incentives for people like Mark, why they do this kind of reporting. And so the question, let me just pick out the relevant sentence here. It says, to be more specific, in the New York Times or the Washington Post, what are the newsroom's policies of investigative journalism? How much does a journalist earn in average per month, and how many reports he must publish accordingly? And most important, when he finishes a series of investigative reports, will he get paid higher for these articles? How much higher exactly? You can say he or she.
So, I could start at the end. No, most reporters, all reporters that I've worked with, I think there are some freelance reporters who try to sell individual projects and maybe put them up for bid. And that's true of people who write books, for example, who may have an investigative project they're marketing as a book and get more for that. But investigative reporters at the Washington Post are on salary, and they get paid the same if they have a Pulitzer Prize winning year as if they have a year where they have some dead ends. And I think that our support is really not only to the support of those institutions is not just to the reporter, but to the act of producing investigative reporting, which involves dead ends. And so you don't penalize people for running down a good, legitimate subject that in the end we decide either isn't a very good story or hits some other legitimate snag. So, generally speaking, investigative reporting is done by people we consider our best reporters of a certain kind. Now, there are other skills that other people might have that we also value that aren't investigative skills, but I think since the 1970s, becoming an investigative reporter has been a high aspiration of aggressive, talented journalists, and so there's a lot of still competition to get onto those teams. There is some status associated with it, and in some cases that's reflected in their pay. But I think that if the author of the question is wondering, perhaps, should I try to do this as a career in the hope of finding a high salary, it's more of a gamble now than ever.
Mark, any thoughts to you also about what motivates the investigative reporters that you know?
Yeah, it's certainly not pay. And Phil's right. I mean, we're not paid by the story or what. I mean, I think that I think the term investigative reporter is also probably broader than it was. I mean, big newspapers have, quote, investigative teams of people whose job it is to dig into big topics for long periods of time and produce long stories. And the Times has one, the Post has one, others have them as well. So I'm not on the investigative team. I'm a Washington reporter. I just happen to be covering a subject that I guess requires more investigation sometimes than others, just because naturally pretty much everything I cover is secret. So as opposed to covering the White House or the State Department where there are regular briefings, there's a lot of public news. There isn't on the beat I cover. So I guess it takes more investigation. But I think that probably because of the competition in the media these days and the people's ability to get basic news from all sorts of different sources, everyone, certainly in the Washington bureau of the Times, in a way has to become more of an investigative reporter. Your job is to not just report. If you cover the White House, it's not just to cover a briefing of the White House press secretary, because that doesn't distinguish our paper's coverage from anyone else's. It's to dig up information. It's to dig up something that others don't have. I mean, that's being basically just competitive, but it's also, I think, it's especially in this environment, we've got to be more analytical. We've got to do things that others can't do. And I think that's, because of the financial problems that newspapers are in right now, that's what everyone has to be doing.
I would just say, I think what Mark says is great. I'd add that I've known a lot of investigative journalists over my career, and I think that you can control for the normal amount of people who want to be more famous or want to get paid more, but I think that what you find is a common thread, and what makes people willing to go to jail to protect their sources, willing to go after subjects that are very controversial, where they get enormous pressure from the government. I think, it's hard to exaggerate how much pressure the government can bring to bear on an individual reporter or on an institution.
Tell us the story, Phil. What does that feel like?
Well, I think that there are a lot of stories that before you publish them, the stakes of publishing them are very high. I mean, and there are many examples from the period that Mark was describing in the last 10 years. So the Washington Post published a story about secret CIA detention centers around the world.
And did you feel pressure from the government when you were publishing those?
Well, we were asked by high-ranking officials in the government not to publish those stories because they argued that they would damage national security.
And how does that work? Do they call you in, or is that on the phone? And
yeah, they called us in, and we met with them in person. And they make a case about why they think that releasing this information would be damaging to the national security. And we have to undertake a process of deliberation that we take very seriously, and we try to approach with a lot of humility and for things we don't know that the government may know. But we're also trying to measure that request against what's our responsibility to put facts in the public domain that can help the citizenry be more effectively self-governing, and I think it comes down to those kinds of pretty lofty notions sometimes, right, and to make those decisions.
And to make clear to any of our viewers, particularly people who may be watching in other countries, at the end of the day, though, you consider it your decision about what the paper will or will not publish.
Well, we feel like the Constitution invests that responsibility in us to a certain extent, and that yes, and we have to be able to also face the consequences of doing that, and we don't really often know what the consequences might be for the institutions we represent.
Do you mean consequences about you or others at the paper going to jail, or are you talking about people dying, or something bad happening on the ground as a result?
No, I think that generally, I think we've done this exercise enough that I think we've built in safeguards that have meant that I don't know of any instance in which an individual has been harmed because of a secret that has been published, and there may be I've heard what I think are persuasive up to a point cases about sort of generalized damage to the country's image or other things, but that really has never risen in our discussions to be enough to suppress an important story. No, I'm talking about going back to the Pentagon Papers when newspapers had to cease publishing something because of a court order until the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post. So there can be and reporters potentially going to jail to protect sources. The Obama administration has launched more judicial proceedings against leakers of classified material than any other administration, and that has an indirect effect. It's a type of pressure on the relationship between sources and reporters.
So, of course, you were one of the most senior editors at the Washington Post. Mark Mazzetti, you are a reporter at the New York Times. What kind of pressure do you feel from government officials or others as you're going about working on your stories?
Well, we get it. We get it a lot. It's the nature of what we cover, which is national security and involving national security secrets. The stakes are generally pretty high about things that we're putting out into the public, and so one thing that not everyone might know is that we will always go to the government before we publish to get a comment and give them a chance to respond to whatever we're publishing. It's just the sort of way we do business, is the way everyone does business in Washington. And for that matter, if you cover any government, you're going to call them for comment. And sometimes what happens is that then triggers a response from the government where they ask us not to publish. And those decisions aren't made by me, certainly. It sort of escalates up the chain of command, where I refer people to my boss, the bureau chief in Washington, and I say, if you don't want us to publish this, you have to contact him. And then, what we'll sometimes do is then, if it's the White House asking us not to publish, we will go to the White House and listen to their case, and then we will have our executive editor ultimately make the decision. Now, sometimes what happens is there's some negotiation and horse trading that goes on where we can keep certain details out of stories if they can make a convincing case that these specific details will put specific people in danger. But they have to make a good case, and that happens fairly often where we will take certain details out, but actually not publishing a story, withholding an entire story, the threshold is generally pretty high. But it's a decision that we take seriously, and it's made at the highest levels of the paper.
So we're meeting here on a Friday afternoon when the big story internationally is demonstrations in the streets today in Egypt. We've been seeing this the last few days in Yemen and Tunisia, where it started several days ago. Maybe we can call up on the screen the current WashingtonPost.com story. And Phil Bennett, I want to ask you, if you were working with a group of reporters now, what are the kinds of stories that you might be looking for, especially from the investigative side? Maybe we could share with our viewers how you think about that.
So, so many stories start with the question, what's going on? And, what's happening? And I think it's very unclear what's happening. How are these, so we've seen events in Tunisia, Yemen, Egypt, potentially now Jordan, Syria, other places could be involved. Are they related? How are they related? Who's organizing them? How spontaneous are they? And that question sort of recedes in importance as you think, who's now taking advantage and in a position to be able to take advantage of the social effervescence that's now occurring. Clearly, these demonstrations in each of these cases have been a long time coming. And I don't think that any observer would think that this is, in a sense, a surprise. The timing of it, the volume of it, the speed of it are things that are sort of breathtaking and lead to questions like, I would love to read a really good story about how social media, what role does social media actually play in helping to create the information groundswell that's necessary to mobilize so many people. But I think underneath that, there are also geopolitical questions of great magnitude that we're going to start seeing over the weekend, I think, played out in reporting in the Post and the Times and elsewhere. And those have to do with questions that, if the Mubarak government is going to be short-lived in Egypt, what will replace it? Yeah. It's a country that's obviously very complex, where the leading organized, opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, is a group that the United States government doesn't officially talk with, and so how is the Obama administration, approaching that reality today, and how would it approach it as it goes down the road? So I think that there are real immediate questions just to say, what's going on? How can we describe it? What are the angles that we need to be able to tell as complete a story as we can today? And how do we cast ourselves into the near future to be able to anticipate the questions that many, many people in world capitals are asking today?
Mark Mazzetti, you've spent a lot of time in that part of the world with your own reporting. As you're looking at what's been going on the last few days, what do you think are the investigative stories that need to be done right now?
Well, it's certainly, as Phil said, the opposition, the nature of the opposition in these countries. It will be the interesting story. How much. I'm particularly interested in how much the religious. More extreme religious components in those countries are pushing this along, possibly behind the scenes, not wanting to be the public face of this. And if in fact, Mubarak were to go down in Egypt, what replaces him? And that's the very basic. And what will that mean for the U.S.? I think that from the Washington side, we're very interested in the sort of bind the Obama administration is in how to deal with this. On one hand, the United States is the biggest, the greatest democracy in the world, and if you look like you're not supporting democratic movements, you look hypocritical. At the same time, these autocratic leaders like Mubarak have been very helpful to the United States, in a number of ways, and so there's a lot of concern in the Obama administration about, well, if we lose Mubarak, well, who comes next, and will that be worse? So how Obama and his aides are handling this? Are they pushing Mubarak? Are they secretly helping the opposition? That's what we're particularly interested in, at least as Washington reporters.
And how do you go about doing that? Phil, you mentioned, I heard you carefully say the word officially a moment ago when you were talking about the Obama administration talking to or not talking to the Muslim Brotherhood or other opposition groups in Egypt. There's an implication there that they may be talking to them unofficially but not saying so. So if you're at the Washington Post or Mark at the New York Times, how do you find the answer to that question?
Mark?
It's I guess by trying to talk to as many people as possible and seeing who might want to shed light beyond the party line. Obviously we're getting very, very little information publicly. They tell us that President Obama had a conversation with President Mubarak, and they talked on the phone, and they don't tell us what exactly really was said. So the question is, well, what was said? So you call around, you try to find out exactly what did they say on the phone that the administration is not telling us publicly. What other calls have been made? As Phil said, who's reaching out to the Muslim Brotherhood? It's you call not only the White House, you call the State Department, you call the Pentagon. The Pentagon is an interesting angle here. There's a very, very close relationship between the American military and the Egyptian military. They do annual exercises. Sometimes it's the military relationships between countries around the world that are the strongest and actually the best conduits to get the American message across. So you call the Pentagon, you find out whether the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has had conversations with his counterpart in Egypt. I mean, it's basically the basics of reporting are getting the reporters with the sources in all these different places to call their sources and find out. And sometimes it involves like sort of triangulation, getting something from one part of the U.S. government and using that as leverage to get another piece out in another part of the government.
And of course,
the compliment to that, David, is that then you get somebody and you send them to talk to the Muslim Brotherhood. So that there is a real component of reporting in the field here that's essential and necessary. That it's not just a Washington story, and
Absolutely.
you can liberate new facts and insights and real news from reporting on the ground. Another sort of threatened part of the American journalism ecosystem.
right. But Mark, as you're talking to them, of course, they're talking to you, and they know that you're at the New York Times, and I assume that many of them are spinning away while they're talking to you. And so how do you parse that and make sense and try to figure out what they're telling you, what they're not telling you, and where the truth really lies?
It's hard. Obviously, you have to be conscious of the agenda of anyone who's speaking to you. I mean, as Phil said, the best way to get through it is to puncture through it is to have sort of facts that you have learned elsewhere, and a lot of time that could come from the field. If you talk to the Muslim Brotherhood and they said, "Oh yeah, we just talked someone from the embassy in Cairo, and they said this, this, and this," and so armed with that information, we then present this to officials in Washington, and and if we're confident with it, we say, well, listen, we're going to run with this. We're going to, they would then say, okay, yes, it happened, but here's our angle. It's then sort of putting together all these different pieces of information, obviously with a lot of different agendas, and then deciding ourselves what we think it means. It's difficult. I mean, yes, no one speaks to a newspaper reporter without having some kind of agenda. So even if they're speaking to you with an agenda, saying things very opposite of what the public Obama administration stance is, you have to be conscious of why are they telling you this. So it's difficult. It's certainly not a science. It's more of an art, but we do our best to do it all before deadline every day.
And as we look to Egypt and other parts of the world, how do you think investigative reporting in the United States stacks up with what you see in other countries? Phil, you spent a lot of time in Latin America. Mark, you have in the Middle East. I mean, both of you are pretty familiar with what's going on around the world. How does American journalism stack up on the investigative field?
Well, I think it's an area that, where the country's journalism has really stood out and been a model for other people. I think that it's, and it has its origins in large part for this generation, the preceding generation, in the Watergate investigation, which is known around the world. And I think the idea that you would, I've been stopped at, checkpoints in Serbia where I'd taken out my Washington Post card and a Serbian soldier has said, Woodward and Bernstein. So, I think that created a sort of culture, and I think that it's been a real. I think American journalism has pioneered certain techniques of investigative journalism that have been important. Now, those have been picked up around the world. I think what we might look for the next iteration of WikiLeaks is when WikiLeaks gets a trove of documents from China or from Russia, and to see how journalists elsewhere in the world can respond to those kinds of information.
Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation, and I want to ask a question since we're here at a university. Mark, you're a Duke graduate. If a student asked you, and maybe they have, how do I get into investigative journalism, what would you tell them?
I would say first, try your best to get a job at a legitimate news organization. Legitimate, and that means, can mean anything these days. It can be either a newspaper, it can be a regional newspaper, it can be a website that does, that does work that's, you'd say, nonpartisan to some extent, that objective news. And then that could be, through an internship or whatever. And then just basically, you don't have to sort of say, I am an investigative journalist. It's just you cover an area and do your best to sort of perform a watchdog role in whatever area you're covering. So if it's government, whether it's Washington government or local government, your job is to kind of get under their skin and to sort of and find things out that they don't want you necessarily to find out. And that's the sort of basic, I think, most fundamental role of journalism. And so, you can certainly call yourself an investigative journalist doing it, but it's basically just being a reporter. And so, the problem, as Phil alluded to earlier, is that there's fewer and fewer, certainly regional newspapers that do the kind of work that they used to. And so it's maybe going to a website, going to a nonprofit organization that does a sort of a type of journalism, and people are getting their starts in all sorts of different ways these days than they were, say, 20 years ago.
Phil, I'll let the last word be yours. You're teaching here at Duke. Maybe you can just tell us a word or two about what you've been teaching and about the advice that you give to students who want to go into journalism, investigative or otherwise.
Well, I teach a course on secrecy that last semester, and on reporting the kinds of secrets that we've been discussing here. And this semester I teach a course on Islam and the media that involves students doing projects with Muslims in the Triangle. And I teach another course on narrative and the internet, which really tries to look at how you adapt storytelling to digital forms. It's giving advice to would-be journalists is always it's always difficult. Journalism. It's being a journalist is sort of like being a chef or a rodeo cowboy. You only sort of do it by doing it.
Yeah.
And so the advice that I find myself giving is very similar to Mark's. Find the places where you can develop the skills and have the experiences. If you're getting a job at a journalism brand, but you're actually not doing journalism, you're aggregating content from someplace else, and you don't really have a path to be able to go out and collect information, sort it, synthesize it, understand it, and write about it clearly. If you're not somewhere in that stream of doing things, you're not acquiring the skills that I think eventually will be marketable in one place or another. And the final thing is, innovate, invent. I have no doubt that we're at a point where new forms, new models will emerge, and they'll emerge out of the people who are forced to create them in order to create the path for themselves. And so I expect that people who have recently been students or are students now will be the ones to do that.
We'll let that be the final word. Phil, thank you so much for joining us here at Office Hours today. Mark Mazzetti, thank you for joining us from Washington. We appreciated your making the time during what's a very busy reporting day, no doubt.
Thank you very much.
And thank all of you for watching. Next week on Office Hours, we'll have a very different topic. We're going to be turning our attention to marine biology, and you'll learn about whales. We hope you'll join us. And for today, thank you for joining us.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.